It started with a kick of sand to the face. They were on the beach, the Fontainebleau Hotel in Florida. She had accidentally let the gate go. The next time he grabbed her and ripped her favorite shirt. When they went to the store to have it replaced, he mimicked and mocked her in front of the sales clerk. Each time there was an incident and it was followed by gifts, apologies. Each time she wanted to believe. It escalated one time in Atlanta. They were at a convention. He choked her. He hit her head on the side of the table. She screamed. He gagged her. The next morning, he insisted she be down at breakfast. Everyone saw the bruises and nobody said anything. She was in Atlanta, financially dependent on him, so she went home with him. This repeated for years, and they had broken up, but she went by his condo to help do some laundry for him and for her. She had left his favorite pen in his pants pocket. He went to assault her yet again. She walked out, and that was the turning point. I'm asked so often to speak in our community about the complex issues that Triangle Family Services addresses, and often people want to know, what do those people look like? Those people who abuse and those people who are abused. Well, it happens. They look like you. They look like me. That story was my story. Suddenly, you're in a pattern of behavior you never thought you would be in. I didn't know that there was help back then, and I didn't know that there was help for him back then. But I'm proud that a program like the one we're going to talk about this morning at Triangle Family Services exists. We provide the tools needed to adjust and to learn how to change patterns of abusive behavior. I have since gone on from that relationship and married my soulmate, Jerry. They've been married for over 30 years. I hope this message this morning is received as intended. In some ways, it was easy to write and really hard to deliver. One of my long-term donors told me about a book written by Rachel Snyder, No Visible Bruises, as soon as it was released. I literally ordered the book that day and devoured it, and have shared with many of you this morning the book, and each of you will receive a copy. When I read the book and I turned the pages, she was telling my story in different views, and I couldn't put it down. I knew we had to get Rachel into our community to have this conversation with all you leaders this morning. Then the coronavirus hit. Rachel kept writing and kept researching, and I knew that it was even more important for her to be able to share what's going on in this issues-oriented conversation around Wake Up with TFS. So it is my honor and sincere privilege to welcome Rachel with us here this morning. And I'm going to launch right into some of the questions because I could spend the day with her, and I want to make sure we cover the important topics that are on the minds of everyone with us this morning. So Rachel, welcome, and I'm going to start just launching in. So you write and research from a systems change perspective on domestic violence, and there's a lot of communications around victims, but there's not a lot around this system change and looking at it from a lens of the abuser, the victims, and the system change. So I'm really curious, what led you to that piece, and why did you write it from that perspective?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all, and thank you for doing the work that you're doing, and for keeping on in this unprecedented time. I think that word is overused these days, but it really is unprecedented. I guess partly I'll answer that from a personal perspective and a professional perspective. I felt like you can't have a one-sided argument. You can't have a one-sided conversation. And so without hearing that other side, it felt like we were really never going to get anywhere. And as a journalist and a writer, I'm curious, right? I'm curious just generally walking around the world. My daughter and I are always um, embarking down on these little rabbit holes of research, and I realized there's all kinds of research on violence, on violent men, on the origins of violence, and there's all kinds of research on victims of violence, but I didn't see them in any place together. Not certainly not that was accessible to the layperson, right? And I consider myself a layperson. That's one answer. The other answer was when I was growing up, I had a very tumultuous relationship with my stepmother, and we had a couple of physical fights. It's hard to say who started them. I mean, I was a very, very angry teenager, but I felt that. I felt that rage toward her growing up. And so in some ways I could almost relate more to someone who had that kind of that anger well up in them, and then now I'm an adult and I have a child and I just don't have that anymore. And I wanted to understand the mechanism of that. I mean, for me, writing this book was about, it wasn't just about telling stories. It was about what can we do? Like, how do we do this? And so you have to have every voice at the table, I think, in order to come up with a comprehensive solution.
Yeah. So in your chapter about watching violence in a fishbowl, you share some startling statistics around domestic violence and the prevalence, and you really compare it to cancer and heart research. That was fascinating to me. Can you explain that a little bit further?
Yeah, I mean, let me tell you, every time you were shocked when you were reading this book, I was shocked when I was writing it. I mean, it was stunning to me to just learn basically how all of us who may not have a long history of domestic violence in our personal lives still intersect with domestic violence. I mean, that's one of the main points of the book is like, why should you care if you're not standing at the receiving end of a punch? Why should you care if you're not in prison for domestic violence today, right? Um, I mean, we spend unbelievable amounts of money trying to solve public health problems. We're in the midst of trying to solve probably the public health challenge of our age right now. And we're throwing tons of money at it, right? And so you can see the ways in which public health affects daily life. And so part of my point, including those stats and including that data, is that domestic violence is a public health crisis that is not positioned that way. Just this morning, there was a homicide, domestic violence homicide, in which the term domestic strife was used in the newspaper article. Now, I'm a journalist, right? I am the media. That is a problem in the system in which I am involved in. Domestic strife is an argument with your husband or your wife, right? Like, that's pretty normal. What was going on there was a crime. And so my system, the media system, minimized that, right? That's part of the problem, is that we're not sort of positioning this in a way that gets at those things like cancer or heart disease to say this is just as much of a threat, right? Mass shootings is another one that I go to in the book, and in fact, in the book I talk about a statistic from Everytown that says 54% of mass shootings are domestic violence. People gloss over that sentence and they don't think about the actual language I'm using there. They are domestic violence. They don't predict it. They're not precursors for it. They are domestic violence homicide. So what that means is that you have a case like Newtown, like Adam Lanza, who starts that mass killing with the homicide of his mother, right? That is an actual domestic violence homicide mass shooting. You also have situations like Sutherland Springs or the Orlando Pulse, where the shooter has all this domestic violence, extreme domestic violence in his background, and is never charged. It's never taken seriously, is downplayed by the media, by the police, by everyone involved in that situation. And so as a result of that, he's able to get a gun and kill 50 people or kill 29 people at church or whatever, right? So that 54% is somewhat misleading, because in fact, when you look at the intersections of domestic violence, it's much, much higher than that. It's terrifying. We should all be concerned about this. We should all care about this.
Well, that's interesting. In your book, you talk about hurt people hurt, healed people heal. So help us understand, as you talk about how each of us needs to care about that, what can we do? I mean, what role can we play as leaders in curbing domestic violence and curbing fatalities? Is there something that we can do collectively or individually?
That's probably the most asked question I get, and it's the most important question. Of course, it's the most important question. I mean, I'm up here talking, but you're actually there on the streets doing it, right? Like, you're the front line. Let me tackle that in two parts. Like, the first thing is hurt people, and healed people heal people. The first time I heard that, I thought, oh, that's so brilliant. And then I kept hearing it again and again and again. And I realized it's like a mantra in the domestic violence world. And I think the thing to understand is that abusers started as children, most often, who witnessed abuse. The children right now who are in this pandemic that we're dealing with, who are seeing this, we are grooming the next generation of victims and abusers, right? So that's what that statement really means, that we have to intervene when these kids are young, so that we're not just raising generation after generation of victims and abusers. The thing about the abuser intervention classes, and I'm going to get to the second part of your question, I won't forget, but the thing about abuser intervention classes is that once you get past the bravado and the this and the that and the, like, of course men are going to put on their best face for me. Like, I understand that. I'm an educated, researcher. I've been doing this for 25 years. But once you get past all that, what you see is real vulnerability and real pain. There's not a single abuser who's happy being an abuser. And that is a really important piece of information for us going forward to understand. The second part of your question, I think, in some sense, is more complicated. What can we do? And I guess I would answer that a couple of different ways. I mean, from a domestic violence agency perspective, what you're doing, all these, the ways in which you're combining resources and populations and communities to form teams is exactly, I think, what the most effective jurisdictions do. I also say, reach out every time you do a training. I mean, domestic violence agencies do lots and lots of trainings. And, every time you do a training, I would reach out to all of your clergy in the local area. Because the fact is, victims go to clergy probably much more than they go to police. So I think we need to get them involved. I would invite school nurses to your trainings. I would invite, whoever you think is going to interact with the population of people that you're dealing with. I would invite employers to your trainings, right? Anybody who could be part of this conversation and part of, like, this body of awareness that we're trying to create when we're creating, cultural and social change. I mean, the fact is, you look at any social movement in our history in the United States, and laws and legislation and policy always follows social change. So it really does have to start, I think, with us in our communities. As individuals, it's a little tougher, because those are really difficult conversations. You open by talking about your own story, right? When you're in Atlanta and you're at that conference and no one asks you about those bruises, you also don't talk to anyone. And you shouldn't have to. It should be on us, right? As community members. But I think there's so much shame associated with that, because you think, well, I chose him. I married him freely. This is my fault. He's being really sweet to me now. Maybe it won't happen again. Like, all those things, we need to understand all of that. It shouldn't be on the victim, right? It should be on us. I sort of equate it to the anti-racist movement. I had the privilege of being Ibram Kendi's colleague for a couple of years at American University. And one of the things that I've learned about being an anti-racist ally as a white person is that it's on me to educate myself. It's not on my black friends or my black brothers and sisters to educate me. They got enough on their plate. And I think the same is true of domestic violence. It's on us to educate ourselves about these dynamics. And I think, I know this is a long answer. It's a Snyder family trait to give really long answers, but I think that one of the things this pandemic has done in the last 5 months or 6 months or whatever, 6 years, what is time anymore, is create an authenticity in our communications. I know that when I sign off on an email and I say stay healthy, I really mean it. And when someone says that to me, they really mean it. And so I feel like now is a time where we can literally reach out to neighbors that we haven't known on our street and say, do you want to go on a socially distanced walk together? Right? We can create friendships and community, even within our little like block to block area, and open up spaces for people to be able to talk. I've made a new friend in this pandemic, my neighbor who lives sort of catty corner. And I think it wouldn't have happened without the pandemic. So there is opportunity here.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about that in some of your articles that you wrote during the pandemic about this hostage situation of being held in place. And so, right in line with that, I'm really curious what, in addition to the very pragmatic things that you said that we need to be thinking about, is how can we prepare once the shelter in place order is lifted to be able to help move through in a trauma informed way the huge influx of people that we're going to see from all sides of the domestic violence issues, the victims, the abusers, the children, and we are concerned about that. But are you seeing either nationally or through your research systems that are working and people that are getting prepared to be able to handle this?
To be honest with you, I don't know that people are really, I feel like people are really living day to day. In some sense, it's kind of an exercise in Buddhism, maybe, right? Like live in this moment. I think that we need to prepare, and the way in which we prepare is to have counselors at the ready, to have therapists at the ready, to have maybe our clergy be more trauma informed, right? To have people who might be trained and ready to jump in to answer those hotline calls as they increase, all of that stuff. Maybe the time to do more police trainings on things like strangulation or choking. On the west coast they call it strangulation, and the East Coast they call it choking. It's so hilarious. I mean, it's not hilarious, but it's just amazing the differences and they're adamant in each place. But I think that now might provide an opportunity for us to be able to offer some of those services so that we have people at the ready, because we really just don't know what we're going to face. We really don't. I talked to a district attorney in Milwaukee at the beginning of June, and their homicides were, by the end of May, at 58, which is more than double what they normally have. That time in 2019, they had 24. So we really don't know what we're going to be facing, but we know that it's going to be bad. I'm really not sure. As a journalist, I think I'm limited in what I can report on if it's not actually something I can say this is happening right now. And because we don't know what's happening right now, it's been hard for me to even report on things. I did a story recently on battering intervention, abuser intervention courses. Many of them have gone to Zoom and gone online. Some have stopped altogether. But the surprising thing about those that have gone to Zoom, in most jurisdictions, they have had to become voluntary instead of mandatory, because they don't have probation or parole offices, right? So the piece I was writing really was like, what does it look like when all of your systems of accountability have disappeared overnight? They've disappeared, right? We have people working out of their homes. It's sort of, with limited ability, really, and limited oversight. And what they've found in those battering intervention classes is that on average, about 80% of those guys still show up.
Yep.
This is shocking. I mean, this flies in the face of what we assume about violent people, that they don't want to become nonviolent, right? It's like alcoholics, you have to want to not be an alcoholic before you can really successfully become sober. And I think the same is true of violence. There have been two studies, 2019 studies, that have looked at abuser intervention classes that have been really promising in the outlook that they have. Recidivism rates are down across all crimes for those who complete the programs. So
now, our program continued during, went virtually and remotely, and we do continue. And exactly what you're saying is exactly what we're seeing here. And that program is so essential to be able to continue. And our attendance is up. You think of some of the barriers of transportation or having to miss work, and, they can actually get the services and move through and changing their behavior. So I want to be very mindful of our time as we close out here. And is there anything else that I didn't ask that you wanted to make sure that our leaders here hear from you as it relates to no visible bruises?
I think that this is a story that I only really wrote just the very surface of, and I feel like there's much more to write. I'm continuing to write about it, and you all are doing the really important work. So I guess I would just really say thank you for continuing on, for doing what you're doing. You're saving the lives of our children. Really, that is the most important work that can be done in this world, I think.
Thank you. And thank you, Rachel Snyder, for being with us this morning.